questions of property rights and ownership are often at the center of environmental debates. Who absorbs the costs and benefits of a particular development activity? Who has authority and responsibility to manage resource use? And who has a right to live and work in a particular place? In our society and many others around the world, such matters are often sorted out through the laws and institutions that govern property. And it's not uncommon to hear people say that possession is 9/10 of the law. Not surprisingly then, many people attribute environmental problems to questions of property rights or the lack thereof. For example, have you ever heard the phrase, "the tragedy of the commons"? Even if you haven't heard this exact phrase, chances are you're familiar with the thinking behind it. The tragedy of the commons refers to the idea that clear, individualized property rights help to protect land and other resources from degradation by giving the owners an incentive to take care of their property. It follows then that land and resources tend to be neglected, degraded, or overexploited when they are not owned as property. This theory was put forth by 19th century economists, and the classic example of it involves shepherds allowing their flocks to overgraze an area of common pasture. Because the pasture is treated as a commons rather than individual property, no one takes care of it, and over time it is overgrazed and degraded. In 1968, an ecologist by the name of Hardin published a journal article titled "The Tragedy of the Commons." In this article, Hardin expands on the original notion and argues that humans are breeding themselves to a planetary tragedy of the commons by not restricting population growth. Hardin proposes to address this by ensuring each family has ownership of its own resources and thus an incentive to limit family size to a level that fits the resources they own. This thinking has since evolved into one of the most influential environmental narratives of our time. Many academic theories and policy frameworks have been built on the assumption that the commons are destined for tragedy. But this assumption has also provoked controversy. Led by the late Nobel Prize-winning economist Elinor Ostrom, scholars in the field of common property theory have argued that many societies successfully use common property regimes as a way to effectively manage their resources. These scholars distinguish common property resources from common pool resources. Unlike common property, common pool resources are those that are treated in a free-for-all fashion in which no collective management is undertaken. Imagine a fishing ground with no regulating authority. That's a common pool resource. While there are plenty of instances in which common pool and even common property resources have been overexploited, the tragedy of the commons narrative overlooks many examples to the contrary and projects the need for individualized private property to cases where people have their own effective ways of managing resources. Ostrom and her colleagues have identified operational common property regimes, or CPRs, in all corners of the globe and in many different types of environments, from montane forests to grasslands to fishing grounds. Many of these CPRs have been in place for generations and reflect fine-tuned knowledge of the local environment. In fact, where we find tragedies of resource use, it's often in the aftermath of a CPR being disrupted by a shock, such as an influx of settlers, a commodity boom, or a climate event. Although the focus on individual property rights remains widespread, common property theory has helped to advance new approaches to environmental management that seek to support local institutions and common property regimes. As a result, cooperative management involving partnerships between local institutions and state bureaucracies has become more common, particularly in the case of indigenous populations. Such approaches are often seen as more effective and culturally sensitive than the universal application of individualized property rights. More broadly, this growing attention to common property regimes fits within a broader policy shift that favors decentralized, participatory, and community-based approaches to conservation and development. So, are property regimes at either the individual or collective level the solution to most of our environmental problems? Perhaps, but there's a problem with this question because embedded within it is the assumption that property is a universal way of relating to the environment. In reality, however, property is a culturally specific way of relating to the environment, a way that seems natural and inevitable within a capitalist society, but that may seem quite foreign to people in other types of societies. In many indigenous societies, for example, personhood extends to the land, plants, and animals, and human persons relate to them as moral beings rather than as objects that can be owned as property. Property then is not a universal category, and thus it can be problematic to expect certain communities to present their environmental practices in the language of property, even if it's the more inclusive notion of common property. In your readings for this week, you'll encounter a variety of perspectives on the role of property, including one that points to its incompatibility with certain indigenous practices. As you read, ask yourself what sorts of cultural assumptions are built into the concept of property and how this concept shapes your own interactions with the world around you.